Good morning, everybody. Give it a few seconds for everybody to get in. So it looks like we have a little bit of a smaller group today, which could be fun. We could have more of a sort of an intimate conversation about any questions that you guys have. And we will kind of go over as an overview and then obviously the specifics of the changes in the contract. But first, I do want to start with the disclaimer, which is that the following presentation is provided to North San Diego County Association of Realtors members and other real estate professionals for informational purposes only, and not as legal advice or to define the real estate professional's standard of care. The instructor's views, my views, are my own and do not represent the association's position. For advice regarding specific questions, please contact the appropriate professional. And if you don't know or aren't aware, CAR has a legal hotline that you can always contact and ask specific questions, usually regarding a transaction. But in addition, they have a huge library of legal seminars and seminars in general, but usually put on by either the association attorneys, Gov. Hutchinson, some of the classes that they put on are just fantastic. And as nerdy as I am, I enjoy them just in general, but you may want to review if you have any questions specifically regarding transactions or specific sections of contracts, et cetera, how to utilize, what if somebody, asks something, how you answer it, that kind of stuff. That's something that is available to you. And of course, always consult with your broker and, any administrative people in your companies with regard to what their policies are and what their suggestions are as well. So that having been said, what we're going over today is the listing agreement and the BRBC. And one of the questions, and this is kind of an overall statement that has been coming out lately with regard to the new policies and the new direction as delineated by the DOJ, is how we deal with buyers, right? And open houses and things like that. And while we're not going to go through the open house process today with that form and everything about it, I always call it the Hawaiian, the ONI-C, OHNISI. One of the questions or one of the statements has been made that you cannot allow anybody in an open house unless they have a signed form. And that's not necessarily true. If you are representing them, yes, you cannot show a property without a signed form. But if you're holding an open house and somebody just wants to come in and wander around like a neighbor, and they do not want to be represented, depending on what your, again, brokerage, broker of record suggests or the homeowner asks, you can simply have those people sign in and or not even sign in. Again, you're not a doorman. It's not a bar. So again, if you have questions, I would suggest strongly recommending that you speak to your brokerage, your manager, or again, if all else fails, the CAR attorneys are more than happy to answer those types of questions. Okay, so let's start with the form itself. And if you are unaware, on the forms itself, you can pull up just your, here you go. Let me go into the main screen here. There we go. Can you guys see that? Or is it not sharing? Why is it not sharing? There we go. Okay. Can somebody raise their, or put a thing in the chat if you can see that or not. Okay. I can never tell what what you guys see and what I see, if it's the same thing or not. So when you pull up the listing agreement, you will get this form first, right? Which is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. You guys are all familiar with this one. It is not anything that's going to change in any way, shape, or form. So hang on just one second. Let me grab this format. There we go. So this you're going to be filling out with the information that you've provided, and then it goes to the residential listing agreement, exclusive authorization and right to sell. When you fill out your information on the overall sheet, it will fill each one of these out. So you don't need to secondarily fill out each one of these pages, obviously. But you want to make sure that the information is correct. And then when you get into these sections here, if you have not been on a training before, I'll just point out really quickly that this first section here corresponds to this section in the remainder of the contract. So 4G in the remainder of the contract specifically refers to this section that you're going to be filling out. And you're going to talk about the beginning and end date of the contract and the specific listing. Is it a single family home? Is it a manufactured home? Is it a probate, conservatorship, guardianship, etc.? This will automatically attach those forms to this page as well. Then you have the compensation to seller's broker, which is only the seller's side of this transaction. This is only your payment and what you are going to be receiving in exchange for your expertise, right? So this is where you negotiate. I'm going to be holding open houses. I'm going to do this advertising. I have this expertise. I've created this marketing platform, et cetera, et cetera. This is where you talk about why it is that you deserve that X percentage that you are going to be asking for, or flat fee, or this percentage plus a TC fee, whatever that is. Or, and we've seen this actually a couple of times, attached compensation schedule. If it sells for this price, or if it sells for this price, then this is the amount. Sometimes that has played into this. And if it's purchased by my Uncle Bob, it's going to be this amount. If everybody else, it's this amount. So that's what the compensation schedule would clearly delineate. If the broker represents both buyer and seller, the buyer side compensation will be identified in a separate written agreement. So the continuation of right. So one of those questions that's come up a lot is, what does this mean? And that is, if, for example, that contract expires and you haven't sold that property, which is kind of unusual in today's listing environment, but just in case, or if for some reason they decide to take it off the market, that continuation period is after the end of this agreement. How long after that time frame are you protected for the extension of this listing agreement, right? So if the listing ends on January 1st, then how long does it go after that you are still covered if one of those people purchases this property? Seller's obligation to pay previous brokers if they have listed with somebody else and it didn't work out, and that broker has 6 people listed that purchased or that viewed the property, and if they purchase it, their continuation their continuation period crosses yours, then you what of those agreements will apply? And that is where that is clearly delineated. So you want to make sure all of that is clearly understood. Then we have, again, clear understanding. What included items are going to be sold with the property. So this would include things like the chandelier in the entryway. There's a outdoor kitchen, and the barbecues and the refrigerators in that outdoor kitchen, that kind of thing. If something is unclear, if something also is, it's a 5-acre piece of property and they want to include the riding lawnmower, that kind of thing would be included here. There is no price associated with these items. They simply go with the property. Excluded items, if that chandelier is Great Aunt Edna's and you want to make sure that that does not get sold with that property, you would put that here. The advice is always to take that down before the property goes on the market, because if you have some amazing, gorgeous piece of antique chandelier work, the likelihood that the buyer is going to want it is pretty high. So rather than have that be an issue of conflict, it's always best to either remove it or really clearly delineate that it's not there. I mean, if it can't be removed, for example, like it's 72,000 pieces and it just can't be moved until the actual time that it's going to be moved. But again, my always advice is going to be to avoid the conflict in the first place. Leased items, propane tanks, solar power, water softener, alarm system, stuff like that. Anything that doesn't belong to that property owner, you want to make sure you include that there. With solar systems, that's going to trigger sort of a secondary set of questions, which is there a contract? Is it owned? Excuse me, if it owned. Is it leased, and when does that lease renew? What is included in that lease, et cetera, et cetera. Liened items also can include things like there was a real large spate for a while of property owners that were getting loans to have new windows put in, new roof put in, all these things, but they put a lien on that property so that it had to be paid at the close of any escrow. So always make sure you check. The homeowner sometimes is not aware, so you want to make sure that you check that listing agreement. The title contract on that property and see what actually has a lien against that property. Smart home features. This has become an issue lately, which is one of the reasons it was added here specifically. A lot of property owners have, cameras or security systems, the Ring doorbells, that kind of stuff. When that first came out, it was much more cost prohibitive to replace them. Now it's not as big a deal, but certainly still needs to be identified. Property will be marketed in the following MLS. A lot of people belong to more than one MLS. And so again, you want to make sure you list all of those MLSs. And again, the seller instructs, specific to the MLS, seller instructs broker to not take or use photographs in marketing, except as required by MLS rules. Most of us know that the MLS requires that you have at least one photo of the exterior of the property on that listing. Not a very good idea to only have one photo of the exterior of your house always for any listings, but some sellers do want to have very kind of generic photos included and not anything that, for example, shows artwork or specifics of the location. Sometimes there's been issues with regard to privacy. So there are extenuating circumstances, and sometimes this little specific box needs a little bit further clarification. The timing of the presentation of offers. This is one that's become an increasing issue recently with regard to seller instructs broker to present all offers received as soon as practicable, which the definition of practical can be a little bit tricky. Or the offer shall be presented on X date, or how many days after the property is listed as active on the MLS. We've seen a lot of that on the MLS. All offers will be presented on Monday, on this date. So, make sure you have all your offers in at this time. So that's where this comes in. And because there have been a lot fewer listings recently, this becomes more and more of an issue. So make sure that you're very, very clear about what that timeline is for the accepting of offers, the presentation of offers, and whether or not up until the close of escrow, you would be willing to accept other offers, for example, in backup position. Investigative reports, the only one that's automatically checked is natural hazard. So you're, probably gonna, if you have a property that is going to be presenting these information. So we've had, for example, a property that was in escrow, fallen out of escrow. It's now back on the market. You have the listing and they have a structural pest report and a property inspection. Homeowners docs have already been called. You're going to obviously pull up a preliminary title report. Maybe they had the roof inspection, et cetera, et cetera. Anything like that that you have in your possession or that this seller is going to provide to you is what you're going to check. The only thing they are required to produce is the natural hazard disclosure, and that's by statute. Obviously, we're going to say you need to get a preliminary title report to make sure they own the property, that there are, again, no other liens on that property, and that for example, there have been instances where there have been more than one homeowners association, and those homeowners associations have dues. So you want to make sure that you are very clear. We suggest this one, but it is not, again, by statute or requirement that the seller has to at the initial listing. Exceptions to ownership or title, if there are any, that's what you would need to discuss. And again, have a discussion with your title rep and the homeowner as to, maybe they gave a part ownership to their niece, nephew, uncle, cousin, whatever. Make sure you have that clarified. The seller intends to include a contingency to purchase a replacement property. Again, this is a very important part of this. There have been a number of instances where this has been a problem because it's very difficult to find additional properties. So unless they're leaving the state to an area where it's easier to purchase, this can be a very big play in the purchase timeline for that property. Make sure that that is very clear. Seller opt-outs, whether they want to have a key safe, lockbox, or signs. Some signs are not allowed in some homeowners associations. For example, Rancho Santa Fe does not allow signs. Other areas require specific sizes, colors, and locations of signs. So you want to make sure you understand that. It has to do with your area exclusive knowledge. Additional terms, again, this can literally be anything. If this person, if you buy the house, you get the boat that's in the driveway, but only if it's this price. I mean, there's just so many things that could be part of that. And then advisories and addenda. Broker compensation advisory is the BCA form, and that's an automatic. It just clarifies. It does not say what the compensation is. It just says there are these things that exist. And it clarifies for the seller. Short sale, not as common, becoming a little bit more common, unfortunately, but it is not nearly, the 2008-9 range of stuff. REO, same thing, not common, but certainly out there. And then trust advisory, that's one that is a lot more common. There's a lot of trusts out there, and make sure that you have that form filled out properly so that that information is clearly delineated in the signature block, etc. Any addenda, if there's anything in addition that goes with this listing, this is where you would add that. So the compensation, I know this is going to come as shock to everyone. The compensation to the broker is not set by law. And they are set by each individual broker and may be negotiable between the seller and the broker. The advisory is included in as I said, all these listings. The compensation to broker, the seller agrees to pay the broker compensation as specified in paragraph 2C, and the unrepresented buyer compensation is going to be a separate form. And again, that's going to be negotiated separately between that agent and that buyer, unless it is you, in which case you would still do it on a separate form. or even another agent in your company, because that would technically be under the same broker. Compensation terms is the completed transaction or seller default. So this is one that was changed a teensy bit in this last go around. And that is the completed transaction or seller default if during the listing period or any extension broker or any other broker, seller, or any person procures a ready, willing, and able buyer whose offer to purchase the property on any price and terms is accepted by the seller, provided the buyer completes the transaction or is prevented from doing so by the seller. The broker is entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from such offer closes during or after the expiration of the listing period or any extension. So remember that form or that section I talked about earlier with that extension after the terms of this listing. So if you had, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever that was, if this escrow is completed, prevented from closing during the term of the listing and that extension, then they would be entitled to compensation. Continuation of the right to compensation for the broker procured buyer. So this refers again to that section that I was talking about above, where if this contract cancels and you have buyers that were qualified and you give that information to the seller before the expiration of that contract, then that would be that section that would be put in with their names and the brokerage. Okay, so one of the questions was, what about the AAA? What about the AAA? Do you want to ask what specifically you're asking about? I'm not sure what you mean. Denise Costa. Yeah, if you have any addenda, yes, that's where you would add it, is in the addenda section. If you had anything that is in addition to the contract, it sort of makes sense. An addition is an addenda, right? So you just add it to the addenda. That's actually a handy thing, by the way, when people are talking about an amendment versus an addendum. So just think about that in terms of what you're doing. Is this adding to or changing the contract that you have in place? So you're either amending, which would be a change, or you're adding, which is an addendum. It's kind of a handy mental exercise to go through when you're looking at what form you're using. Some people use them interchangeably. They're really not. So just again, think through what it is you're actually doing. Additional compensation terms, the buyer breach and seller recovery of damages, and that gets into some of the legal stuff, but again, it clarifies what those instances are. And it's specific to if you've been through a lawsuit or arbitration or anything like that. And then the seller instructions, they irrevocably assign to broker the above compensation from seller's funds and proceeds in escrow. So that system is what is okay, so sorry, I missed this. In C4, do we need to, and we have time since we have not a ton of people, so I'm going to kind of go back a little bit on this if you guys will bear with me on this. In C4, do we need to put the brokerage's name or their buyers who viewed the property? So let's go back up to C4. So the broker goes here, and then the broker is the name of the broker is up here. So it would be, XYZ company. And then you showed the property to, 2 different buyers. So that would be, Bill and Mary Jones and, Fred and Susie Anderson. Okay, so if within, say, 60 days of the cancellation of the contract, the company that was listed before, so the prior company, which is XYZ company, showed it to Bill and Mary Jones, Fred and Susie Anderson. If those people buy it within 60 days, then of the end of that contract, so that may or may not be 60 days from the beginning of this contract. If they purchase that property, if these people purchase that property through this broker within this time frame, then they are owed compensation. And that's why it's very clear that it's very specific that these people with this company in this time frame. And that's why that's there to, again, clarify. I always say good fences make good neighbors, and that's why it clarifies the relationship. Okay, so the maximum listing, okay, sorry, there's more. I love this. Okay, so I answered this. Okay. Items included or excluded. The maximum listing period allowed by law for residential property improved with 1 to 4 units is 24 months from the, and this is a new change, by the way. This was sort of identified more clearly with this latest iteration of this form. The maximum listing period allowed by law for residential property is 24 months from the date this agreement is made. And this was kind of a reflection of, there were some listings that were like 10 years and 5 years. And they, there was, I don't know if you guys were aware of that situation where they were paying them a sort of a nominal fee. And if they sold that property within 10 years, they owed a commission to that company. So it was kind of, this was an answer to that in the sense that it limited the amount of time that somebody could basically tie up a property. If you have a 24-month listing, that does not mean you can't then extend at the end of that 24 months for an additional timeline, but you have to have an additional signature with the seller and your company agreeing to that timeline. This is only per chunk, right? So you can only do it at a time for 24 months. That doesn't mean 24 months, poof, you can never go back. Items included and excluded and included. All fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property are included. So it does seem like this is I don't know, should be understood, but there are a lot of questions. And actually my favorite is the one section that was checked, which was bathroom mirrors, which I thought was hysterical. Okay, so let me ask this. Even though a commission to buyer's agent is not on the MLS, it's not clear whether in 4B you list the total commission, including the buyer agent commission, or is that negotiated at the time of offer? It's negotiated on a separate form. That's why it says any compensation if the agent represents both the buyer and the seller, that compensation will be negotiated on a separate form. So that's going to be the buyer representation form, and that's always going to be a separate form. So in 4B, where it says you may or may not represent both sides, it always is going to be another form for the other half of that compensation. It used to, when it first started this form, there was a section in there if you were going to represent both sides, and you could sort of pre-negotiate that. They took that out because the intent of the agreement with the DOJ was that the buyer had the ability to negotiate always. And if you pre-negotiated that, then you would not be able to, the buyer, excuse me, would not be able to have the level of negotiation that they wanted them to have. So you're always going to have a separate agreement with that buyer for what you've agreed to work for them for. You then negotiate with the seller, assuming that you know if you're representing that buyer, what that number is. If you don't represent that buyer, if it's a different agent, then that agent would negotiate to try and get that number for their buyer. if they wanted to, basically, or if they were going to pay it themselves, then they would pay it themselves, and then you would negotiate price based on that. So all of this becomes part of the negotiation. The numbers are still there. The buyer is still going to be paying the price for the property based on whether they're going to pay the commission or compensation to their agent, or if they're going to ask the seller to do it and have it be, you know, wrapped into their loan. A lot of buyers nowadays, we've all talked about this, where the prices are so high that they don't necessarily have, you know, thousands of dollars sitting in their couch cushions. And so they want to have that compensation rolled into the loan so that they can pay it over time rather than have that up front. Again, that's a negotiation that you have depending on your buyer, depending on the situation, depending on your seller. All of those factors become part of this negotiation. And if your buyer wants to have that price include the compensation to the seller and have that be part of the agreement with that seller, then that would be reflected in the price. So especially if you're representing the seller in this case, you know, you would talk to them about a net sheet, right? And have that net sheet be the clarification of what happens with those numbers if the buyer pays it himself, or if that's rolled into the loan and it becomes through their side, essentially. And it's the way that it has been done has made it easier for buyers. And so a lot of buyers naturally are going to want to have that still continue. And so you want to be able to have that discussion with your seller. Okay, so if this, you know, if you want this net, then here's the price that we need to work within. If this guy comes in and says he's going to pay it himself, then we can adjust those two things so that the numbers come out the right way, or the way that you want them to. So that the buyer has some say in this, the seller has a say in this, and then you can negotiate those two numbers, which is what we do. Okay, so the leased or owned or not owned liened items. Again, this has become an area that has become increasingly problematic because we have, for example, people who signed on to a solar lease with a company that's out of business. And then this becomes a problem because, you know, who's going to maintain it? Who's going to watch it? You know, who's going to, who are they paying it to? So it's taken over by a different company. Maybe that contract isn't in place. There've just been a number of hiccups with regard to that. And that's something that you need to pay attention to because that's certainly been an issue specifically with solar. Although there have been other companies that have been problematic, but definitely pay attention to the things that come up with regard to the leased properties in particular. Okay, so seller representation. Seller represents that unless otherwise specified in writing, seller is unaware of any notice of default recorded against the property. And believe it or not, we've seen some of those recently. Any delinquent amounts due under any loan secured by or other obligation affecting the property, any bankruptcy, insolvency, or similar proceeding affecting the property, and any litigation, arbitration, administrative action, government, et cetera, and any current, pending, or proposed special assessments. That's another issue that's come up. We had some properties with, for example, an elevator that was going to be replaced, and they were assessing each of the units in that building a certain amount, but it was something in the future that wasn't necessarily known. So again, you have to be careful about what these assessments are. You need to talk very closely with the homeowners association, make sure that your title is working with you and the homeowners association to make sure that all of that information is provided. Strongly suggest that you have your buyers read through the minutes when they get the copy of the homeowners association paperwork. Because a lot of times those minutes will show things that are upcoming that aren't necessarily reflected in the official paperwork. So again, it's attention to detail and very specific questions. And that has to go with some of your knowledge of the communities and the specific area that you're selling, or if you're working with a buyer that the buyer is looking at. Strategies affecting delayed offers and buyer broker compensation. So again, this goes to, we're going to look at all of our offers on this date. We're going to have them all, everybody's going to give their offers to us by Friday. Sometimes that's the best way to go. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, we are selling our property because we need to get the heck out of Dodge for a job or whatever. And so we're going to look at, all offers as they come in. And sometimes sellers prefer to do that. Sometimes they want it all at once. It's up to your seller. You want to have that discussion with them and talk about the pros and cons in their specific situation as to which one is going to be better for them. The seller instructs broker to present offers. And this is, again, kind of going to be the answer to that conversation, how they want those offers presented as soon as possible or in a clump. And that would be these two choices. The buyer supplemental offers. This is one that isn't really as big a deal as it was in the very beginning when this came out, which is don't send the buyer love letters. And that is because it can expose the seller to some litigation should one of the people who was not chosen feel that they were discriminated against because of someone who was chosen based on one of those letters. We have, all these kids, we want to have, we love dogs, we're, husband and wife, wife and wife, whatever it is that they feel that they were discriminated against in one of the protected classes. You want to make sure that this is just sort of a blind choice based on the best offer on that property. And an offer is composed of many things. It's not just price. Sometimes it's time. Sometimes it's additional, like we don't necessarily want, grandma's chandelier. And we do want to take that really crappy riding lawnmower off your hands. And, we're going to give you an extra 30 days in the property. And, all of those things, those are what really should be looked at rather than, oh, they just look like a lovely, couple. So again, you don't want to expose a seller to inadvertent discrimination problems. So we just take that out of the equation. If they still want to see if there are any of those buyer letters, you need to make sure that they understand that they're acting against broker's advice. And there's actually there's a form for that. You want to be very, very careful that that isn't a deciding factor. The seller good faith. And if you remember back to your original real estate licensing, the components of a contract are good faith and fair dealing. And that's the basis of a contract. And so you want to make sure that that is adhered to in this form at all times. Investigation and reports. The seller agrees within the time specified to order and, when required by the service provider, pay for all reports specified in paragraph 2F. So remember, that's where I said the only one that's required by statute is the disclosure form. The rest of those forms, termite, the property inspection, any of those, pool, roof, whatever it is, those are not required. However, if they agreed to them, that they agree to then produce them within the amount of time specified. And undisclosed conditions, incomplete or incorrect information. This is one that's a real interesting one because the seller further agrees to indemnify, defend, and hold broker harmless from all claims, disputes, litigation, judgments, and costs arising from any incorrect or incomplete information supplied by seller, or from any material facts that the seller knows but fails to disclose, including dangerous or hidden conditions on the property. We have all seen, and most of us have seen, transactions where, the property closes and the next big rain that happens and the buyer's in the house and suddenly there's a river running through their yard and they scream bloody murder that the seller knew and didn't tell him, and the seller says, well, that's never happened. This is, the biggest rain we've seen in 100 years. So all of those issues are issues that can come up that the seller may or may not have known, or, oh my gosh, I forgot. Yeah, there was that one time that it happened and we forgot to mention it, or something like that. That's what this is referring to. It's there, and it's there to protect us. It's just better to be very thorough. And make sure that you ask some probing questions. Looks like there's a big hill behind this house. Have you ever had any water running through the yard? That kind of thing. Again, use your common sense and make sure that you do as much as possible to protect both yourself, your buyer, and your seller, should there be any unanswered questions. The deposit, the broker is authorized to accept and hold on seller's behalf any deposits. I don't know of a broker out there that was like, yeah, sure, go ahead and have them give it to us. It's automatically going to go to escrow. Most brokerages do not want to touch that. I have been in the industry long enough to remember that there were a number of agents who would sort of half proudly show off the number of deposit checks in their drawer that had never been processed. And that is a huge violation. And part of the reason it's become an issue. You don't want to touch any money having to do with anything with a seller, even if he's going to, pay $100 for a replacement something. Don't have him give it to you and you give it to the buyer. If you touch any piece of paperwork that has money attached to it, you have to log it in and out, and give its process for the entire time it was in your hands. So you want to make sure that that's not something you do. Just have it go directly to escrow or directly to the buyer or seller, depending on which side is providing that information. The seller acknowledges a receipt of a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. Again, that was the top of this form. And the seller representation, again, possible dual agency. You're going to go through this directly with your clients and explain to them what this means. If you represent the buyer and the seller in any transaction, that there is always the possibility that either side could claim that they did not have the best representation, right? You were strongly in favor of the seller. You were strongly in favor of the buyer. I'm always in the belief that it's probably in the best interest of either party to have maybe somebody that you work with represent the other side, pay a referral, anything like that. I think it solves problems rather than create them. But again, that's your call and your company's call. But I'm a big favor. I'm in favor of avoiding problems rather than creating them. Showing properties, seller acknowledges that the real estate brokers must have written agreement in order to work with a buyer before showing properties to that buyer, and that some buyers working through broker may consider or make an offer on the seller's property. The seller consents to broker entering into a representation agreement with the buyer, and if that buyer makes an offer on seller's property, the broker will become a dual agent representing both that buyer and seller. So again, this is referencing the new requirements for a buyer representation agreement. And this is specific to a buyer. Again, clarifying, it's not just people seeing the house. If you want to have if somebody wants to come look at a house and they're like, I'm only want to see it for their decorating, I'm going to come to the open house, or whatever, or I don't want to be represented, then they would just simply say, I'm not being represented. If they are a buyer and they are interested in that property, they have to have representation in order to view that property from that agent. You simply can't go without agency representation. And this is where the questions come up about open houses. Potentially competing buyers and sellers, but to clarify this, by the way, you are only required to have an agreement if that buyer is going to work with you. If they're looking at that property and do not wish to be represented, they can simply sign a form that says, I'm not being represented. Potentially competing buyers and sellers explains that you may have two people in your company who represent buyers on that same property. Technically, that would be the competing buyer and seller with the same brokerage. And that's specific to what that possible representation of more than one buyer or seller means. Unrepresented buyers, if a buyer is interested in viewing a property and is not already represented by a real estate broker and such buyer refuses to be represented, then they would sign a document saying that they do not have representation, which is the BNA form. The confirmation of agency relationship, again, clarifies what that relationship is before you enter into the contract itself. So again, this is our responsibility to explain to our listing and buying agents or public who we represent and what that representation means. How to terminate that agency relationship, again, if you have that extension of time or not, it's specified in this agreement. And again, you would go back over that. Security insurance, showings, audio, and video. Most of this is the same from the previous listings, but again, you want to be clear if there are recording equipment in that property, you want to note it and make sure that people are aware that there are security cameras. Photographs and internet advertising. This clarifies what that seller wants to do with those photographs and with that internet advertising. You can opt in or out of the additional property use of those photographs. If, for example, you're previewing a property and, you know, a lot of people will do this, well, they'll take pictures of the house and say, oh, is it this great house today? And it was so wonderful. And it's not your listing. You don't have the right to do that. So if you are going to be taking pictures of an open house that you're at, you have to have permission from the listing agent and the seller. So before you just sort of higgly-piggly do that, make sure you have that clarification. You want to acknowledge that the prospective buyers coming into the picture, the property may take photographs. So that's a little bit of a different situation because they don't have the same responsibility that you do as an agent who is represented and has a code of ethics. And the broker doesn't have the ability to control or block. You know, you're not going to be out there covering up the screen for everybody to take pictures. So they may take pictures unless the seller says no cameras and doesn't allow them in the house or something odd like that, which we've actually seen in some super high profile people's homes. But it's not common. Key safe lockbox explains what that is. Again, some of these forms are the same in the previous forms. Mediation, additional mediation terms. It clarifies what all of those forms mean. And I strongly suggest you walk through this with your sellers as well. All prior discussions, negotiations, and agreements between the parties concerning the subject matter of this agreement are superseded by this agreement. So in other words, if you had a conversation with a seller and he says, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, and then in the contract changes it, this is what holds. Ownership, title, and authority, legally authorized signers. Again, if you have a individual versus if it's in a trust, or if it's in a if it's a LLC or anything like that, you want to make sure you have that clearly defined and that they understand. So the entity sellers here, the name of the person is Jane Doe, right? But Jane Doe Family Trust is who owns that property. So technically, the owner of that property is Jane Doe 2 Family Trust dated January 2nd, 2014. What you're doing here is you're saying this is who owns this property, but this is who is legally able to sign for that, so that that person, you know, this should be Jane Doe. I changed everything. Okay, so the printed name of the seller is Jane Doe 2 Family Trust, and the name of the person who can sign is Jane Doe, and that would be Jane Doe would sign here. And then we have the multiple listing service addendum. So this is kind of an interesting clarification, because again, as I mentioned, some people belong to more than one MLS. This explains what the MLS service, what the MLS service does, how it provides advertising for that property, what the exposure to the MLS is. When you opt out of the MLS, what that means. You can reduce the exposure. You can not have we always call it eyes. How many eyes are on that property affects the ability and the time with which you sell it. So you can reduce the number of eyes on that property. Clear cooperation policy. So this is one that's been in the news a lot lately, is the clear cooperation. Whether or not that's going to stand, whether it's going to hold, we don't know. It's still part of the negotiation, the discussion. Currently, what this is when you have a property that's listed, you cannot reasonably withhold that listing from other agents who are in that marketplace with whom you are cooperating on the MLS. So the MLS is a cooperation of an aggregate of all of the listings in that area, which allows those agents to view all of those listings and the buyers. I don't know if you've ever talked to anybody who's tried to purchase property in Europe, but it's extremely difficult because you have to go to each one of the dozens, if not hundreds, of companies who may or may not have listings in an area. And each one of them has their own sort of private listing agreement and service, and they may have 3 or 4 properties, and then this company over here has 5 or 6 properties, and then this company over here may have the exclusive on this one property. And so in order to see all of them, you kind of have to query all of the companies that you can find, and you may or may not know all of them. So it's extraordinarily difficult to then get all of that information and put it in one place, which is what the MLS does here. It's really kind of the envy of most buyers of other areas. And while it's changed over time, and we're certainly looking at making it more friendly towards buyers and sellers. All in all, it's an extremely helpful system to put everything in place. The clear cooperation policy clarifies that you can't unreasonably withhold information. You can, of course, keep property off the market if they're replacing the carpeting, or they've got visitors, and Adna's coming in this weekend, and so we definitely can't show it because she likes to cook sauerkraut or whatever. So you have the ability to take it on and put it off the market for periods of time. But generally speaking, if something's on the market, it's on the market, and everybody has the right to see it. And that's the overreaching idea behind clear cooperation. Coming soon status, impact on marketing, days on market does continue, and it kind of depends on the MLS. CRMLS has a very specific rule about the listing timelines, because a number of companies or agents were taking properties off the market and then immediately relisting it and getting a brand new listing timeline, which is not accurate, and paints a picture that is not correct for a buyer. If you say, oh, look, it's brand new on the market, and then you look back and it's been listed and relisted 17 times and has actually been on the market for a year and a half, that's not an accurate representation for a buyer. Whereas if you have the actual timeline that property has been on the market, then it's better for a buyer. And the seller instructs the broker to market the property. And this is, as I mentioned, they have the ability to have it delayed. So it will only come on the market, maybe within 2 weeks. So you have it listed, but it's not technically going to be marketed for 2 weeks because they're finishing a painting or whatever they're doing. And that gives a lot of flexibility, but again, it kind of levels the playing field so that everybody has the same right to view and sell properties. It's not perfect. There are certainly areas that could be improved in this, and I think there's a lot of people that agree with that. But it's the best system we can find. Okay. The property address. So this is kind of interesting. So that the seller can instruct the broker to have the MLS not display the property or the property address on the internet. So the SELI form is the one I mentioned earlier. If you don't want to have this disseminated outside of the MLS and just have it be on the MLS and not through all of the myriad of other companies out there, the reason for that is a number of, not all, but a number of sellers don't wish to have their information and their pictures and everything else out there forever. And as we know, the internet is forever. And once that is secondarily sent to the internet, it is extremely difficult to pull it back. A lot of that information, you can request the various companies to take that information down. They generally won't unless it's the owner of the property. But if you wish to not have it be secondarily displayed on the other sites, which again, not super common, but there are a number of, very private individuals or, potentially high worth individuals that wish to do that. That is something that is available, or sometimes we just have very private people. So again, that form, you want to make sure that you discuss this with them and explain to them what that means, is that it will be on the MLS, but it will not secondarily be viewed on all of the websites out there. A lot of people search those websites. So again, it's that same idea of how many eyes you have on that property. You may wish to, for example, they have expensive artwork or something that they don't necessarily want out there. Don't take pictures of that, right? Make sure that there are no identifiable, photos out there, that kind of thing. Anything that is of importance to your sellers, you want to have this discussion with them before it becomes a problem. And go through these issues specifically to clarify how they want that handled. For some, it's no big deal at all. For others, it is. So make sure you know what your sellers wish. So you want to, again, make sure if they do elect to utilize this, you're going to check this box: seller elects to opt out of certain internet features. Again, seller concessions. And this is where you talk about the section of the internet, which would clarify whether or not they are going to offer concessions. And that can be roof, flooring, or potentially buyer compensation as well. However, you cannot delineate which they're going to be offering. It can be just a round number. It can be a specific amount. They could have it in their head that they will. You don't have to have that number delineated. You simply say, yes, we're willing, or no, just come in straight and, don't talk to us about that. Or this gives the ability for the seller to kind of be in the driver's seat of that as to whether or not they're willing to work with the buyer on that or not. And this would be the box that we check. And again, you'll notice there is nowhere in here to put in what the amount is. Visitors ending the touring, the property may take photographs. And again, this is the same thing that was mentioned up above. Broker doesn't always have the ability to stop them. So seller instructs broker to publish in the MLS that taking of images is limited to those persons preparing appraisal or inspection reports. It's a notice. Again, you're not going to necessarily be able to stop them, but you certainly can notify them that that's not something you wish. You can put notices up, you can put in the MLS, etc. And that will, again, be up to your seller as to how they want to do it. This goes through the seller advisories. I would have them read through this, ask you any questions that they have. This has not really changed much, except with the regard to the specifics of the buyer compensation, pre-sale inspections and considerations, things like that. This is more specific to Northern California. We tend not to do a lot of pre-sale inspections. Depends on your views on that. I think it can be helpful, but especially with regard to termites, for example, you don't want to find out on the day before close that you have to tend to things like that. Can be helpful, but it's up to your seller as to what they want to do. The broker compensation advisory is an automatic. And this is a general form that will clarify what that is. It's negotiable. If a buyer is unrepresented, again, it kind of goes over the same information that was in the listing, but this is very specific to just this issue. The broker, I can talk. Broker may represent both buyer and seller in dual agency, and specifically what that means is the broker, not necessarily you. That's a broker dual agency, and there's also single agent dual agency. Those are two wings of the same bird, but different wings. The buyer representation compensation is fully negotiable. So similar to the conversation you have when you take a listing, you're going to explain to him that you have that same conversation with a buyer when you're working with a buyer. His compensation is negotiable as well. And that compensation then is negotiated at the time of the purchase contract. And again, that goes back to the discussion that we were talking about earlier with regard to the net sheet and what your seller wants to end up with out of this property. You want to be able to have this conversation sort of facilely with regard to both the buyer and the seller, and making sure that he understands, she understands what that means. That it doesn't mean, so when this first happened, a lot of people were coming out going, yeah, it's free now. No, it's not. What this means is they have the ability to negotiate that. And how they negotiate that, whether they are represented, unrepresented, represented by the same brokerage, different brokerage, same agent, different agent, all of that plays into that negotiation and those numbers, which are, again, fully negotiable. So that is a conversation you want to make sure that you are able to have and get comfortable with having. And I strongly suggest that you maybe do some practice sessions, right? There's scripts out there. I'm sure your brokerages would be happy to work with you. Maybe your managers, other agents that practice. Pretend that you're a buyer and this is the seller, and you're doing the negotiation. And how are you going to answer this question? And how are you going to answer that question? Practice makes perfect. It also makes it easier to have that conversation when it comes up. Then it's my first time, and we all get nervous, right? I remember the first time I showed a house, I felt like I was breaking and entering. It got easier over time. Same with this. Just work it. Requirements for written agreements. Everything has to be in writing and understood, clearly understood. So we get a lot of what we call agent law, where agents write stuff that it's like, what did that mean? And, 6 months after the contract, the agent doesn't even remember what they were talking about. So make sure that if you're writing something into a contract, it's clearly understood what that is. Advantages of written agreements. Again, that's that good fences make good neighbors thing. As long as it's clear and it's understood and you've explained it, then it makes it a smoother transaction. Less chance of there being problems. There, no guarantee there's not going to be problems, but there's less chance if you have it in writing. And again, when you are going through this form, a lot of this is pretty self-evident and clearly identifiable. And some clients don't necessarily want to go through all of this stuff. Just make sure you know it so that you can if asked. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. Again, it goes through what this means, which each section means, the sort of legalese version of what that agreement means. And here's one that I think is massively not understood, I should say. Offers are not necessarily confidential. Buyer is advised that the seller or listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or conditions of the buyer's offer unless all parties and their agent have signed a written confidentiality agreement. Whether any such information is actually disclosed depends on many factors, such as current market conditions, the prevailing practice in the real estate community, the listing agent's marketing strategy, and the instructions of the seller. In other words, if you as a buyer write an offer on a property, the listing agent and the broker can take that information and tell another buyer, you need to hit this price or go above this price. And it is completely within the terms of that contract that is allowed. So make sure you understand that when you write an offer, it is not confidential unless you have in writing from all parties that it is confidential. There has always been sort of this, I don't know, belief that nobody can disclose anything about a contract that was written, and you can't play one against the other. You absolutely can. If it is in the best interest of your seller, you absolutely can. And your job is to get the best price for your seller. Okay, so that is this form. Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory is also attached to it. These are all the forms that are automatically attached. The Consumer Privacy Act is going to be attached. The disclosure regarding real estate relationships is going to be attached. All of this stuff is going to be attached. And this, by the way, I think is going to be removed. This disclosure in regarding real estate agency relationship is actually attached to the buyer representation agreement. So it is assumed that this is going to be a standalone. And so your even though you have it on the top of this form for the listing, it's also going to be attached to the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, because assumably that's going to be a separate person. It's going to be the buyer. So the buyer, does anybody have any questions? By the way, we just finished and I sort of snuck past it. That was the listing agreement. If anybody has any questions about the listing agreement before we move on to the buyer, we've got about half an hour, so I want to make sure we get to it. Okay, good. All right. So the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement is the one that most people are having agita about. And it makes sense when you think about it in terms of the overall picture that we have always had a listing agreement when you take a listing. And we have always had that discussion up front, sort of, I'm worth this, I should be paid this. And now we have it for the buyer side. And this gives buyer a little bit more, I don't know, autonomy over their own world, that they have the right to say, all right, I'm willing to go with this amount. You're amazing and are totally knowledgeable and know what you're doing. And I love working with you and you're super helpful and all of those things. And so I think this is a fair amount. That's the discussion that you have. The reason people are nervous about that is because we haven't done it before. So again, that's another one of those practice kind of things, right? So have this discussion. I've never had it be an issue. And again, if you talk about it in terms of, and I've actually utilized this, bring in a listing agreement and bring in the buyer's agreement. So whenever I take a listing, I have this agreement with the listing, with the seller. And now we have an agreement that you, Mr. Buyer, get to enter into as well and have that ability to negotiate your half of it. And then we can talk about things like whether you want to have that be part of the contract and have it go through the lender and have it part of your loan, or if that's going to be something that is paid up front so that you can maybe negotiate differently on the price. Again, most buyers in this market, especially if they're first-time buyers, aren't necessarily running around with $1 gazillion in their back pockets. So the likelihood of having that be part of the loan is a bigger number. And I'm sure, as most of you have since become aware, the lenders have sort of identified that amount as separate from, we're all familiar with that 3% margin that the seller can have, I mean, that the buyer can have, that will then not affect the loan. This is separate from that. So that compensation amount, if it's part of that contract, does not enter into that 3% range that they can't go above for their loan, to run afoul of their loan. That's also something that the VA has agreed to, that the VA up until, this change, did not allow any buyer compensation to be paid by the buyer at all. And because of the way that this has worked out, they sort of have had to. But having it rolled into the loan just clarifies for them much more easily then, they still have their requirements for, like the seller has to pay for any repairs, et cetera. It still is in place. The buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, you're going to put in your buyer's name here. It's going to put your company name here. And then this is is kind of interesting. And this has been, I don't know, not necessarily everybody agreeing on this, but it is a 3-month timeline. You can extend. It doesn't mean you can't extend. It just means, and by the way, and especially in this market, if you haven't found them a house in 3 months, then, maybe you're going to expand your range. Maybe you're going to change your price. So a lot of this is going to be sort of automatic anyway. But you are limited to only 3 months of this agreement. The completion of the transaction, whichever occurs first. So I've had that question asked. If you go into escrow, for example, on the last day of that 3-month time frame, you have to extend. No, because this will be in effect until that deal closes. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything that even though this timeline is up, and you're still in escrow, it doesn't negate you're still going to be, bound by this agreement. And then non-exclusive or exclusive. There is discussion on this, by the way, that it may become all exclusive, and the non-exclusive exclusive may go away. It hasn't been decided yet, but that is something that is in discussion right now. And it's clarified and we'll go down to that in a minute, what that means specifically. The property types are single-family residential is an automatic, including condominiums and manufactured homes, or single-family homes are excluded and you're only in multifamily or 5 or more, industrial, vacant land, or you can do single-family, including condominiums and vacant land. So depending on whether you check this box or any of these boxes. So this means it's not going to be single-family residential and only vacant land. But if you don't check that box, it means single-family residential and vacant land. Okay. That was a question early on, and it is not super clear, but it is, it does mean that it's single-family residential, including condominiums and manufactured homes, and these, or if it's checked, not single-family, and then whatever one you checked. The locations can be a county or a city. So San Diego County, for example, or San Diego City, those are two different things. If you have somebody who only wants to live in the city of San Diego, or you have somebody that says, I don't care where in San Diego County, that's what I'm looking for, or maybe it's Riverside County, excuse me. That's where you're going to clarify that. What you don't want is the entire state of California and everything. There's no way you can be an expert in the entire state of California. So at least do individual cities at a time. Additional description, only ranches, only, properties with barns, only, I'm looking for properties with pools or whatever your buyer is looking for specifically. You can add an additional delineation in this B3 section. Additional buyer identification of preferences and priorities. There's a whole form of that. And it clarifies things like, pools, non-pools. I have a little bit of an issue with that just because there's this saying in the industry, which it sounds mean, but it's really not, and that's buyers are liars. And it's not that they're actually lying or intentionally mean about that. It's just that they don't know what they want. How many times have we, had a buyer who said, I only want X, Y, or Z, and you show them something that you were like, I know this doesn't really match, but I just thought you'd love it. And they do, and they buy it, right? We've all done that. So that's the buyers are liars thing. If you have that form that says they only want to see these things, and then they buy that other property, and it can create problems. So I'm a little hesitant to be very specific in the drill down to what properties they actually want to see, because so many times they've expanded that in their final choices. Properties excluded from representation. So they've seen, this house already with another agent perhaps. So, 123 any street is, a property that you are not going to be able to show them. And then the amount of compensation. And this is the one that everybody has problems with. Honestly, you can always modify this. And there is a modification of listing, buyer representation, or other agreement. All of this can be modified. It's negotiable. So we have this funny thing that we have this agreement and then that's it. That's all we can ever do. Well, no, you can work with buyers and sellers always on anything that makes the deal go. We've all done this. So don't panic because you have an agreement. The one thing I will say is if you have a specific amount here and you eventually represent them in the purchase of a property, and that seller is actually offering or has suggested maybe a higher amount, or you even negotiate that in the contract, you cannot accept more than this amount that you've agreed to here. This is the agreement between you and your buyer. And should that number have been negotiated higher in the contract, then that number that's above that amount is at the buyer's discretion, not yours. So just understand that this amount is not able to be increased, at least automatically, if something is offered. You can always modify a form. You can always modify this form, but you'll have to have agreement to do that. And I don't know too many buyers who would say, sure, I'm going to pay more and give it to you. You could be that amazing. You just don't know. I've seen it. This is what this says. If the buyer receives compensation from seller or others for brokerage representation, the amount shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E1 right here. The continuation period shall be however many calendar days after the representation period or any extension. So if you have an agreement for 3 months and then you have an extension timeline, you agree to, a month after that, you're going to, change your location or whatever and extend it, that the cancellation, if it's an exclusive, is 30 days after the receipt of that, or if it's non-exclusive, the cancellation effective upon receipt. So again, that may change, but just so you understand right now, if it's a non-exclusive representation, then they can cancel upon receipt of a cancellation. If it's an exclusive, it is 30 days after the receipt of that cancellation. And we've seen that actually where people have gone through open houses, signed in a buyer representation agreement and walked out and canceled it. And so they're still bound by that property. It's one of the things I think that is being worked out. And as we get to a normal on this, people are still trying to find end downs around the way to work these systems. So the buyer is required within 5 days to provide, or if that's changed, they could say, I'll do it in 2, or, we are asking for 10, that the buyer is required to give you that personal information, or they can include it when they sign this. I think, of course, sooner is better because then you have more clarification of the information. But that, again, is something you can talk about with your buyers. Other financial considerations. This is another one that's just really been sort of discussed because of the way it's worded. It sounds like I can't afford to pay the broker. The buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. It's not always the case that they don't have sufficient funds. It's that they don't want to outlay all of that information and all of that money in the down payment or in the broker compensation. They would rather save it for a remodel, for example, rather than ask for the seller to pay a remodel. Maybe that's part of the negotiation tactics. So I believe this is something that's going to potentially be reworded. The buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. That originally was sort of based at VA, but there's also a number of private lenders who will not allow the compensation to be paid to the broker through that loan. And so in some instances, this becomes more important depending on what that loan is. And again, part of the reason to have that information sooner than later, within 5 days, or have it attached, is to know what loan product they're working with. I'm looking for a clarification on the amount of compensation. If E1 says 2%, and so we can't use numbers, but if it says a certain percentage, but the seller offers more, can the buyer's agent not do a modification of terms? Yes, but you would have to do it before you modified, right? So before you agreed to a contract, you can't modify after the fact. So if you have an agreement in place and you sign an agreement for the purchase, and that negotiation results in a higher number, you can't modify that, or you can after the fact, but you would still have to have the buyer sign off on that. And my assumption would be that would be a little more difficult to say, hey, just give me that additional money that you negotiated. Can a BRBC be modified? Yes, that's what this form is. The modification of listing, buyer representation, or other agreement between the principal and the broker. And that actually is further below. I'm gonna scooch down there. So close your eyes for a minute, because this gives everybody adjective when I do this. Buyer's inspection advisory, broker compensation advisory. All of these forms are going to be automatic when you pull up these forms. Modification of listing, buyer representation, or other agreement between principal and broker. So this form is specific to anything: listing agreement, buyer representation agreement, or other. So whatever you're modifying, this is the form to use it. It's an MT, modification of terms. And that those terms can be either for the listing, for the buyer representation agreement, or anything really. Can be a modification of an addendum. You can use this for whatever it is that you're trying to modify. And that specifically refers to the broker BRBC as well as the listing agreement. Again, close your eyes, people. Going back. Going back. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this, and we're almost out of time. So I'm going to try and talk fast. On the buyer representation and broker agreement, so the advisories, addenda, and disclosures automatically attached is the broker compensation advisory. And then you have the additional forms that are automatically attached. Exclusive representation, buyer acquisition, it goes through similar to the listing agreement on the buyer side. It has a lot of the same disclosures. So you can identify for your buyer what these different terms mean and what this will potentially mean for them. It's obviously a different discussion on the buyer side, because a buyer representing, an agent representing a buyer and a seller would have a different impact. Buyers tend to think that it will get them a better price. And so there's going to be a little bit more, probably, I'm guessing, on the side of buyers having mutual representation rather than sellers wishing for that to be their lot in life. Buyer will acknowledge the receipt of this disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships and possible representation of more than one buyer and seller, similar again to the listing agreement as well. A lot of the same information clarifies, by the way, what financial and personal information, and it clarifies in here. And I think it's important that they understand that the buyer will provide relevant personal and financial information, including but not limited to proof of funds. The pre-approval and pre-qualification letter. If the buyer fails to provide such information, or if the buyer doesn't qualify, then the broker can cancel this agreement in writing. And the buyer agrees to include a term in the buyer's offer requesting seller to compensate buyer's broker. And if they require but if they do not have the funds to pay, or if they want it part of their loan, then they agree to this. And that's clarified by this information as well. And then the reasonable care and other professional assistance, the buyer is obligated and agrees to read all documents provided to buyer. And again, part of this requirement that we have, especially with these new forms where people are not as familiar with them, I would strongly suggest going over this with them before you get to that writing an offer excitement, right? A lot of times buyers are just going to be super excited to get that offer in, and they're not going to read it. So you want to do that when it's calm, and arrange a meeting beforehand, go through all of these forms that you can, and make sure that they understand as well as they can, and as well as you can identify for them what their requirements are going to be. Okay, so we are almost out of time, and you guys, this has been wonderful, and I appreciate all of you taking the time and going through all of this again. I'm assuming some of you have done this more than once. I personally have done it probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 times. And I'm certified as a CAR trainer, and I still do it. And I still go through all of the new forms. And just so you know, by the way, the forms are going to be modified again in December. And that's the purchase agreement is going to have a modification where it's going to change the way the BRBC is presented. And so there's not going to be a secondary form attached. It's going to literally be in that contract rather than have a separate form. So there is a, okay, so there was a question. Cancellation without notice on exclusive on a 2-month contract if the buyer feels like the agent's fiduciary duties were not met to the buyer. Can you clarify that a little bit? I'm not sure. That's sort of a general question. If the buyer wants to cancel, they can cancel for any reason on a buyer representation agreement. They can cancel in a non-exclusive. With an exclusive, it's a 30-day notice, meaning the agent did not fight for the buyer on the last transaction. Okay, so that's interpretation essentially. And if the buyer signed an exclusive agreement, they have a 30-day they have a 30-day cancellation agreement in that exclusive agreement. If they want to get out of that, the agent did not, the agent yelled at it. Oh, well, that seems charming. I would suggest that is this you? Is this somebody you know? Is this an agent or a client that wants to work with you as opposed to a previous agent? I'm not sure what that is. This was on your team. I would strongly suggest that you sit down with that person and perhaps your broker, and have a discussion about what occurred. I left your sense input in my notice. Smart girl. You want to be, it's important who you work with. It is important what you present and who you present. So this is a situation that is a little tricky. Again, I don't know the situation or what happened, but I would still suggest that you sit down with the broker, or perhaps a manager. I don't know what the situation is of the team or or what company or anything about it, but it's almost always going to be the manager and then the broker. And then if you still can't get a resolution, then, potentially I would call the CAR hotline. That's probably, my first would be the manager. If you've already left, there may be some animosity there. So I potentially would call, CAR and see what they suggest about it. But that does not sound like a particularly fantastic, and maybe that person just had a bad day. I don't know. Again, I don't know the situation. But almost always, and I do a lot of mediations and I do hearings, and I do a lot of that. And there's almost always situations where, there's something that somebody doesn't know about one side or the other. So I strongly suggest having a discussion, and then requesting a cancellation of that broker and that manager and that broker. And if you can't get anywhere with that, again, I would strongly suggest going to the CAR hotline and having a discussion with them about that, and seeing what their answer is. It's almost always something that needs a little bit more information before it can be identified, what the response should be. Thank you guys all. It is a pleasure to work with all of you, and I've enjoyed this going back through it. It helps me as well. So it clarifies a lot of questions that I run into quite a bit, actually. And a lot of times in hearings, we only get partials on the story. So it's good to have sort of the full picture sometimes. So, all right, wonderful. Thank you. And I appreciate all of you for taking the time, for being professional, and for contributing to your professionalism and the industries. Thank you all, and good afternoon.